Professor Michael Bernhard, Professor of Political Science at University of Florida, and Jan Kubik, Professor of Sociology or Social Anthropology at two universities actually, at Rutgers University in US and UCL, University College of London. It's quite newly. Both of our speakers has published a lot about question of democratization, civil societies, and so on. But their last or latest publication deals a lot with memory questions. They published about memory before as well, but this publication that is called 20 Years After Communism, The Politics of Memory and Commemoration, that appeared 2014, published by Oxford University, is special in many ways because it makes a lot of theoretical propositions about memory from the political science point of view. So we are happy that both researchers agreed to come and present their work that I'm sure will be inspiring for many. Please. And of course about our eminent commentator as well, that will take the floor after the presentation, Marek Kucia from Jagiellonian University, who is sociologist and works currently with a big project about Europeanization of Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We are absolutely delighted to be here. Some of you already heard at least a few things about this project, but this time we will try to link what we have to the topic of the conference. So we will be talking about our concept of embedded agency in particular, but not only. We also will give you an overview of the whole work. That's the book. An e-book exists. Let me shamelessly plug the book. A new publication, paperback exists. Not that expensive, given the price of the books these days. We have several mottos for the project. One of them is from William Faulkner. The past is never dead, it is not even past, which immediately takes you to the center of our approach, which Jeff Olick already eloquently presented yesterday, which is that all of this is happening in the present, but we're particularly interested in the political present. So what we will do in terms of linking it to the conference themes, we will give you a bit of an overview of our concept of mnemonic actors, and we also will offer a few thoughts about transcultural memory. As we started looking through the material that we have, empirical material in the book, we have some observations. And the basic idea that emerges from the material is, given yesterday's discussion about the significance of regions, that the regional issues play a role in framing national commemorations, particularly the commemoration that we are studying, but not always, and actually the national context seems to be dominant. I guess that would be a fair generalization if you look at the whole material that we have. In a moment, Michael will get to that close to the end of the presentation. So our subject is the politics of memory and the role of memory in regime change, but more broadly, we're trying to make a contribution to political science, particularly comparative politics, where relatively little has been written about those issues. The very basic assumption is something that's been driving Michael's and my work since, I guess, we both were in graduate school. We were together in graduate school, two different departments at the same university. And the idea is that you have two issues of tremendous importance in social science. One is collective identity, and the other is legitimacy of power. And both of them are related to the construction of collective memory. We will have no time to talk more about certain ideas we have about how collective memory is constructed, but it is a very politicized process, and it's very different from personal recollections and many different others. We are introducing two concepts. One is a memory regime, one is a memory actor. What the book is particularly about is about one specific memory regime, which is a set of cultural and political practices around a single event. That single event is the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the fall of communism. So if you look at the definition of the memory regime, it is a set of cultural and institutional practices that are designed to publicly commemorate and or remember a single event, a relatively clearly delineated and interrelated set of events, or a distinguishable past process. So the vision of the field of memory, another very important concept, is that it is actually composed of a set of discrete units. Maybe in reality they're not that discrete, but analytically we find it very useful to see it in this kind of granular way, because then you can study relationships between various memory regimes. You will see how it works in a moment. We are also concentrating on a specific subset of memory regimes, which we call official memory regimes. Official memory regimes are regimes, in our definition, that are produced by governments or political parties or major members of the political class. A few days ago we were at a very intense seminar in Tartu, and Eva Clarita challenged us to think more systematically and perhaps more precisely about what actually constitutes the official memory regime. It is a little bit blurry, but the intuition is that those are official actors acting in official capacity. Of course, other actors in the society, particularly in civil society, endlessly generate components or full memory regimes. But we're interested only in this one subset because there's only so much one can do in a single research project and in a single book. But the important thing is this. There is a memory field. The memory field has official and unofficial components, let's put it this way, and both sides are composed of a certain number of distinguishable memory regimes. And we're interested in only one of them, related to the commemoration of the fall of communism. We managed to collect a rather important set of scholars, our friends, our colleagues, who worked on specific cases. If you're interested in specific cases, we can talk about it perhaps later. So, an actor-centric theory of the politics of memory. I will present the basic elements. We proceed from an instrumentalist, actor-centered approach to the development of historical memory. That means actors, particularly official actors, attempt to promote a view of the past that is congruent with their current political aims, power. So this would be extremely voluntaristic. The moment you propose this idea, and you're at least somewhat trained in the history of social thought, you realize that that's not so, right? As most prominently Marx himself struggled with this idea. The idea is that we have agency and we have structure. So the grand dilemma of social theory, agency versus structure, immediately, I guess you can say, rears up its ugly head. So the manipulation of history is subject to constraints of historically developed, socially transmitted, and culturally framed credibility. An actor can propose a version of the past that will be recognized in the social field as ridiculous, incredible. Right? So What is credible is, when you start thinking about it, is something that stays within the limits of those grand sort of constraints that are historically developed, socially transmitted, and culturally framed. Agency is always embedded, that's the basic idea. It is always somehow constrained, meaning that effective political actors, it's another idea related to that, effective political actors know that. And they may act at the edge of credibility, but they know how not to cross over to the zone of incredibility. Two variables of central interest are the type of mnemonic actor and the type of memory regime that emerges as a result of actors' interactions. There are four ideal types of actors. It's a sort of Weberian strategy of creating ideal types. Mnemonic warriors, mnemonic pluralists, mnemonic abnegators, and mnemonic perspectives. There are three types of memory regimes. Fractured, when you have at least one warrior. We have a more elaborate definition of that, but technically it is really what it boils down to when you start coding, when you start confronting your theoretical apparatus with the empirical evidence. So at least one memory warrior, and you have a fractured memory regime. Pillarized, where there's no warrior and there's at least one pluralist, and somehow the actors will accept the pluralist version. In a moment you will see what it is. And the third type is unified. No warrior, no pluralist. Just a word on that. You can achieve this situation in two ways. One is sort of spontaneous, extremely rare, perhaps impossible, where everybody will say, yeah, okay, we all understand our past and there are no issues that divide us, there's no contest here. The other way is not spontaneous, and that's what happens quite a lot, which is top-down, particularly in more oppressive political regimes. Communists were acutely aware, particularly Stalin was a motto we use also in our book, that by controlling people's way of thinking about the world, you may not need to use a lot of material power. If you effectively manipulate people, then you can rule over them. And the issues of remembering the past are very central to this effort. Hence, you have this enormous apparatus of preventive censorship. Many people, my students, they have no idea what preventive censorship is, and it takes some time to explain to people how it worked and how powerful it was. And all of this was designed to control the narrative, obviously. And there was supposed to be a singular narrative. It never worked perfectly, but you know what I'm talking about. And then you can at least come close to producing something resembling a unified memory regime. Now, I apologize that I do not ask you to read all of this, but I guess we are showing off a little bit that we were very carefully thinking how to name, describe, and analyze those four types. So you have mnemonic warrior, mnemonic pluralist, mnemonic abnegator, mnemonic perspective. We took the famous definition of politics and we went who, what, where, how obtains power, controls resources, in this case memory, and then we added the last question, why? The question is, why is it worthwhile or not worthwhile to engage in a mnemonic struggle? And that takes you to the basic principles that ideally those actors subscribe to. So, for example, if you look when is the mnemonic contest taking place, the third line, the mnemonic warriors are predominantly retrospective. Right? This is something that is based on the idea of mythical time. There's only one time, and a mnemonic warrior believes that he or she has the absolute knowledge of the past, and there's only one. and the vision of the world is us versus them. We possess the true vision of the past, the others are inconsequential, stupid, wrong, and so on. Mnemonic pluralist, by contrast, believes that there may be several different visions of the past. There are multiple times, perhaps, and the task is to create some platform, discursively or institutionally or both, that will allow to create a dialogue between the two or three or more versions of the past. The abnegators are those who say, I am not interested in memory politics, or at least in this particular issue, in this particular contest, on this particular event, I am not expressing any view. I'm not entering the game of memory politics. Once we realized that and started observing the behavior of various actors in concrete situations, it became apparent that it really works. That many actors make choices, and they will pick up a fight and become a warrior on an issue A, but on the issue B, they will say, we're abstaining or abnegating, as we call it. Mnemonic perspectives are the people of the left usually, those who are saying basically, let's forget about the past, or let's not focus on the past, let's look into the future. And of course, the famous idea that communism or state socialism was seeking legitimacy by promising something in the future. Most other legitimating devices are based on looking into the past and grounding the principle of legitimation in the past. We are this or that community, we share this or that, we come from this or that mythical location, and so on and so on. Communism was revolutionary also in the sense that it was to be in the future. Well, since the left is weak and decimated and doesn't play a major role in politics in those countries, at least for now, certainly not around the time, although a little bit, around the anniversary celebrations 5 years ago, the perspectives are not important actors in our scheme. Social democrats who play a certain role, actually in some places an important role, are no longer revolutionary leftists, right? They are not proposing a better future. They are very kind of meek and low-key social democrats. So that's the basic overview of the four actors, and out of each characterization comes a specific type of behavior or dominant strategy, as I try to suggest, and I have 5 minutes to go, which is good. In general, the underlying matrix of our work would look like this, right? So you have 2 by 2. I'm coming from the same institution as Marek, and my teacher was Piotr Sztompka, and everything in Piotr Sztompka mind seems to be reducible to 2 by 2s. So yeah, I am genetically damaged, I suppose, somehow like that. So there is a 2 by 2, and Mike is Polonized enough to go with me on that. So structure versus agency, and politics versus culture. Out of that you get political constraints and cultural constraints. You get political strategies and cultural strategies. All of this is described in the book. This is the preliminary matrix. Each of those can then generate several variables. And it did, and we will have no time to talk about it, but the task is to figure out which variables then use in your work. And it's never easy, and there is no golden rule that will tell you how to do that. It is a bit of your social scientific gut that tells you, hey, let's try those variables, not others. I will show you them in a second. Now, out of this 2 by 2, what we're trying to explain is the political strategy. Political strategy has as a variable, if you want to call it this way, has 4 values, right? You are either a warrior, or a pluralist, or an abnegator, or a prospective. So we're trying to find a way of explaining why in some countries warriors emerged, and how. This is the big how. How did it happen? As you will see, it happens not in one way. That's the very interesting, we think, finding of our work. At least it came to us as something new. We didn't know that before we started the project. So in order to explain a variance on political strategies, we use, if you use this language again, independent variables drawn from the three other categories. So the explanatory variables are from cultural choices, cultural constraints, and political constraints. And then very quickly, you'll have to get out of here, is the basic, again, you cannot perhaps see it very well, but what you have in the circle, this is what needs to be explained. Memory regime, I already told you, and you know what they are. We dropped perspectives, so we have fractured, pillarized, unified memory regime, but remember, memory regime depends on the dominant type of the actor. So eventually, really, the project is about how mnemonic warriors emerge, and under what circumstances a warrior doesn't emerge. That's the essence of the explanatory scheme. And then, for example, structural constraints, what we decided to use here is type of state socialism. And in the very basic coding, we have to make certain decisions, we decided to have many different typologies of state socialism, right? There was no state socialism, but there were state socialisms. We know that, but there are many different ways, or at least a few different ways of thinking about it. We decided on a very basic, because the method we're using calls for very basic coding, a very basic idea that there were two types, reformed and not reformed, or hardline. And after a lot of the discussions with the team of our colleagues, and from what we know and from our previous work, we decided that there were only 3 reformed regimes in the set of the cases we're studying. This is Poland, Hungary, and Slovenia. Or, you know, actually all the cases of the former Yugoslavia. The gap becomes complicated. Right? So you have 3 countries that were reasonably called reformed, compared with the others. Doesn't mean that, you know, those people were living in some democratic paradise. But this was a different state socialism. Anybody who studies this thing, or as I know from personal experience, those were very different places than other countries of the communist bloc. Cultural constraints, just to give you one more example, it's the middle category of explanatory variables. Again, we had several candidates. Eventually, we decided to use only ethnic, linguistic, religious cleavages. Again, coding can be tricky, and reasonably different people, different experts may disagree. But we went with the coding that you will see in a moment. And Michael will continue.
So, moving from theory to results, we take the elements that I want to use this so I can I've been at this 30 years, so I figure you'll see that the things that are numbered are the things that we will carry over into our empirical analysis. When you take the work of all our collaborators, we have a sample of 17 cases. We see 5 patterns emerging. We use qualitative comparative analysis that uses Boolean algebra to understand contingent and complex causation. We came up with 3 fracture patterns. First being negotiated extrication, the second being a polarized politics. Ukraine was a singular case. In terms of drawing our sample, we wanted to deal with more democratic countries in the region. We excluded authoritarian countries or competitive authoritarian countries because we thought the dynamics of memory politics would be different under democratic and authoritarian conditions. Ukraine was kind of on the border, and it really didn't fit into all the patterns. It was the only singular case we had. We had two non-fractured memory regimes, one pattern which we call deliberate abnegation, where all actors abnegate. This is a little different actually than Jan talked about in terms of unified. This is kind of a pattern of where nobody wants to play memory politics, and so there's universal silence on it. It's a very interesting and unexpected result. And just in general, depolitization as well. So there's a lot of abstaining from memory politics in the non-fractured regimes in this. Now, this is in many senses a multi-authored work. The theoretical framework Jan just presented to you was presented to our collaborators ahead of time, as was a model Polish case study. We then asked our collaborators to work within the same theoretical framework using the same categories that we framed so that we would be able then to compare cases systematically to each other. And so these are the things that we identified as causal in the theory that John just talked about in the last end, at the end of his part of the presentation. So it's the form of state socialism, the mode of extrication from communism, whether there was a polarizing cleavage, either ethnic or political, at the moment of extrication, or no, not at the moment of extrication, at the moment of commemoration, the strategy taken by the first communist successor party, this thing that we call memory layering, which is when recollection of a specific event is combined explicitly with remembrance of another event. So the easiest way to think about that would be, for instance, well, we'll see it when we discuss the Hungarian case. The Hungarians could not talk about 1989 without talking about 1956. And thus, because 1956 figures as a prominent motif in the commemoration of 1989, we describe that as memory layering because you have the coming together of two memories of two distinct events. And finally, whether that memory layering was displacing. That is, if the recollection of the second event at the other point of commemoration or of remembering was so powerful that it prevented a full exploration of the actual event being commemorated. These are the way our cases broke down in terms of fractured or unified, whether there were Mennonic warriors or whether warriors did not emerge. The Czech Republic was the only case of pillarization we had. Thus, we decided that in our empirical strategy to simply bifurcate the sample into two separate ways of looking at the world, whether it was fractured or non-fractured, because you can't solve for one case. So this was our QCA for warrior emergence. This is an intermediate level QCA. And here we see the singular case of Ukraine and two other forms of fracturing. The first one involves Hungary, Slovenia, and Poland, which had very similar patterns. In both cases, you see a very reform-oriented communist party, which allowed a high level of liberalization, even under communism in comparison to the other cases. Relatively powerful opposition movements, which means that transition was negotiated between those opposition movements and the regime incumbents. This also meant that after the extrication from communism, the communists who negotiated were able to reform themselves into post-communist social democratic forces, which remained viable actors in the electoral system. So the post-communists persisted and were relatively successful in contesting power under democracy. And this helped to produce a very powerful left-right cleavage within the society. This is the, opposition versus post-communist divide that you see very early on in many of these countries. This really opened a potential, the negotiated transition between opposition and reformed communists opens up a kind of very salient political cleavage. That is, there's often a divide on the oppositional side between those who were more moderate and those who